The floor of the observation deck was already shaking beneath my boots before the doors even opened. My name is Mara Voss, and on that day, I was standing in front of an alien admiral who wanted the entire fleet to watch me fail. The ship was called the Trinity's Vow. It was one of the largest warships in the galaxy, and it was hosting a special joint inspection between the Earth Alliance fleet and the Corv Dominion. On paper, it was supposed to be a peaceful meeting, a sign of cooperation, a chance for two civilizations to work together. But everyone knew the truth. The Corv Dominion had never seen humans as equals. To them, humanity was young, weak, a species that had reached the stars too quickly. They believed humans survived only because stronger civilizations allowed them to. And today, their admiral planned to prove that in front of everyone. The massive doors slowly opened. The entire observation deck became silent. Hundreds of alien officers stood watching. Their eyes followed me as I walked inside. At the center of the room stood Admiral Kale Varen of the Corv Dominion. He was a giant compared to humans. His armored body looked like it was built for war, and his cold expression showed exactly what he thought of me. A human officer, a small creature from a young planet, someone he believed he could embarrass without effort. The admiral looked at me and smiled. Not a friendly smile, a victorious one. He wanted the whole fleet to see humanity being put in its place. He wanted everyone to remember who was powerful and who was not. But what he did not understand was something very important. Humans had never survived because we were the strongest. We survived because we adapted, because we learned, because we refused to quit. The Corv had studied our weapons. They had studied our ships. They had studied our technology. But they had never studied the one thing that made humans different: our determination. Admiral Varen stepped forward. The room became completely silent. Every species watching waited for me to lose. They expected a human to bow. They expected fear. But I simply looked at the admiral and stood my ground. Because he was about to learn something the entire galaxy had forgotten. Humans might not be the oldest species among the stars. We might not have the biggest ships or the strongest bodies. But when someone pushes humanity into a corner, that is when we become the most dangerous. I had been ordered to bring Bramble to the inspection line front and center so that the visiting officers could see what an Earth War beast actually looked like. I did not expect it to go the way it did. Bramble stood beside me at full height, taller than any wolf should ever be, with fur the color of wet iron and eyes that tracked every stranger who walked past us. He had been bonded to me since my second year at the academy, back when I was nothing but a nervous cadet with shaking hands and a dead brother's dog tags in my pocket. Bramble was not a pet. He was grown and trained to be the last line of defense a soldier ever needed. A living answer to every enemy who thought humans came to war unarmed. The Corv officers walked the inspection line like they were touring a farm. Their leader was Admiral Calvin, a tall figure with plated gray skin and eyes like polished stone, and he made no effort to hide his opinion of us. He stopped in front of a plasma turret and nodded with something close to respect. He stopped in front of a shuttle bay and asked sharp, precise questions about its output. Then he stopped in front of me and Bramble, and his whole face changed. "This is the beast," he said, not to me, but to the aide walking beside him, as if I were part of the furniture. "The one your reports keep mentioning." I expected something more than an oversized dog. I kept my spine straight and my mouth shut because that is what discipline demands, even when someone is insulting the one creature in this galaxy who has never once left my side. Calvin circled us slowly, his boots clicking against the deck plating. "Do you know what my people breed for war, Cadet?" he asked, finally looking at me. "Constructs, machines shaped from our own biology, built to specification, obedient down to the smallest nerve, and you humans bring an animal, a pet playing soldier." A few of his officers laughed behind him, soft and cruel, the kind of laugh that is meant to be heard. "He is not a pet admiral," I said, keeping my voice level. "He is a bonded combat asset, trained and certified under Alliance regulation." "Certified?" Calvin repeated, tasting the word like it amused him. "Let us test that certification." Then he reached toward Bramble's face before I could get a single word out. I felt my whole body go cold. "Admiral, I would advise against touching him without I did not ask for your advice, Cadet." His hand closed around Bramble's muzzle, gripping hard enough to force his jaw down, the way you might inspect livestock at a market, checking teeth before a purchase. The cameras mounted along the observation deck were rolling. Every visiting officer on that inspection line turned to watch. I saw the exact moment Bramble's eyes locked onto mine, wide and searching, asking me a question no words could carry. I did not give him a command. I never got the chance. Something older than training passed between us instead. Something built into every bonded pair long before either of us was born. It moved through Bramble like a current finding the shortest path to ground. And then it moved through the hand still wrapped around his jaw. Admiral Calvin's whole body locked rigid. His stone-colored eyes rolled back. His mouth opened without sound, and he dropped to the deck like his legs had simply stopped existing. His aide screamed something in Corvith that the translator in my ear didn't even bother to render because it wasn't a word. It was just noise. For one long second, nobody on that deck moved. Not the fleet officers, not the Corv guards reaching for their sidearms, not me. Then everything happened at once. Security swarmed the observation deck from both ends, human and Corv alike. Boots hammering the floor plating, voices shouting overlapping orders in 3 different languages. Someone grabbed my arms from behind and forced them up and back. And I did not resist, because resisting would have made this so much worse than it already was. Bramble surged forward with a low sound building in his chest. And I found my voice before anyone could make a mistake they couldn't take back. Bramble, hold position. I am fine. He stopped mid-stride, every muscle still coiled, but he stopped because in 6 years he had never once ignored that command. Not even now, not even watching me get restrained in front of an admiral twitching on the floor. Get the beast contained, a Corv officer barked, his weapon half raised. Do not touch him, I said. And for the first time in my life, my voice did not sound like a cadet. You saw what happens when someone touches him without permission. Do you want to test that twice in one afternoon? That stopped the weapon from rising any further. Medical teams rushed onto the deck. Both human corpsmen and Corv physicians converging on Calvin, where he lay convulsing gently, his eyes fluttering, his breathing ragged, but present. I watched them work from where I stood, pinned between 2 security officers, watched the fleet's highest-ranking visitor twitch on the floor of a ship he had come to inspect. And somewhere underneath the fear climbing up my throat, a small and terrible part of me thought, good, he should not have touched what wasn't his to touch. Cadet Voss. Came a voice through the chaos, sharp enough to cut through the noise. Captain Owen Blake, the ranking human officer on deck, pushed his way through the crowd with his jaw set tight. What did you do? Nothing, sir. I gave no command. I said nothing at all. Then explain to me why a Dominion admiral is on my deck having some kind of seizure. I did not have an answer that would make sense to anyone standing there, because I barely understood it myself. All I knew was that Bramble had never done anything like this before. Not once, not in every drill, every deployment, every moment. I had trusted him with my life. I don't know, sir, I said honestly. I have never seen him do that. Blake studied me for a long moment, and I watched him weigh a dozen outcomes behind his eyes. None of them good. Behind him, the Corvith security detail was forming a loose perimeter around their fallen admiral. Weapons still raised, eyes locked on Bramble like he was a bomb that hadn't finished exploding yet. Take her into custody, Blake said finally, quiet enough that I almost didn't hear it over the noise. Secure the beast separately. Nobody touches either of them until command sorts this out. Sir, if you separate us, that was not a request, Cadet. I felt the restraints tighten around my wrists, cold metal biting into skin and across the deck. I watched 2 handlers approach Bramble with containment poles raised, the kind we use on hostile wildlife. Not on certified war beasts. Not on him. Wait, I said, twisting against the grip holding me. Wait, let me walk him myself. He'll fight the poles. Please, let me walk him. Blake held up a hand to the handlers, and they paused, poles still raised but not advancing. 5 minutes, Blake said. That's all I can give you. They loosened my restraints just enough to let me move. One officer still gripping my elbow, and I crossed the deck to where Bramble stood rigid and trembling, every instinct in his body, screaming at him to close the distance between us and put himself between me and every stranger on that deck. I knelt in front of him, ignoring the sharp intake of breath from the security officers around us, and pressed my forehead against the side of his skull, the way I had done since he was barely more than a pup. I need you to walk with me, I whispered, calm, no teeth, no growling. Just walk. His ears flattened, But he exhaled long and slow, the fight draining out of his shoulders one breath at a time. Behind us, Calvin was finally stirring, coughing, blinking up at a ceiling he clearly did not recognize yet. And I understood with a cold certainty that settled somewhere deep in my chest that whatever had happened on that deck was not finished. It had only just begun, and when the Admiral remembered exactly what happened to him, and exactly whose hand had been on Bramble's jaw when it happened, he was not going to let it go. Quietly, I stood, keeping one hand resting on Bramble's neck, and let the officers lead us both away deeper into the ship toward whatever came next. I did not know yet that what came next would change everything the Alliance thought it understood about humanity, about the animals we bred beside us, and about exactly why the Corv Dominion had been so eager to inspect our ships in the first place. But standing there watching the doors close behind us and cut off the sight of Admiral Calvin being lifted onto a stretcher, all I could think about was the look on his face right before he touched Bramble. It was not curiosity. It was not simple arrogance either. It was the look of a man testing something he already suspected was dangerous and choosing to provoke it anyway. The holding block they placed me in was cold and narrow, built for prisoners rather than cadets, and I sat on the edge of a metal bench, listening to my own heartbeat for what felt like hours. Somewhere on this same ship, Bramble was locked in a containment bay meant for hostile specimens, and every part of me wanted to break down that door and go to him. But I forced myself to sit still because panic would not help either of us now. The door finally slid open and Captain Owen Blake stepped through, followed by a woman I did not recognize wearing the insignia of Alliance Judicial Command. She was tall, sharp-featured with dark hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful, and she carried a data slate under one arm like a weapon she hadn't decided whether to use yet. "Cadet Voss," she said, taking the seat across from me without waiting for permission. "I am Commander Nora Fitch, Alliance Judicial Command. I will be leading the inquiry into the incident on the observation deck." "Is the Admiral alive?" I asked immediately because that was the only question that mattered. "He is stable," Fitch said, recovering in the medical bay under Corvith supervision. "Whatever happened to him, it did not kill him, though I suspect it frightened him considerably, and frightened men in positions of power tend to look for someone to blame. I did not attack him, Commander. I gave no command. I said nothing." "I believe you," she said, and something in her tone made me look up. "I reviewed the deck footage twice already. Your mouth never moved. Your hands never moved. Whatever happened, it did not come from an order you gave." Blake crossed his arms near the door, watching the exchange with the tired patience of a man who had already spent the last hour fielding demands from Dominion officers. "Then explain it to me," he said, "because right now, the only theory the Corv delegation has settled on is that your beast is a concealed weapon and that you deployed it against a ranking officer during a diplomatic inspection." "He is not a weapon," I said, sharper than I intended. "He is a bonded combat asset." "There is a difference, not one the Dominion seems interested in hearing," Fitch said, "which is why I need you to explain in detail exactly what a bond is and exactly what happened when the Admiral touched him. Leave nothing out, Cadet. Your future and possibly the beast depends on how well you can make this tribunal understand something they have never had to deal with before." I took a slow breath and tried to organize 6 years of training into words that would make sense to people who had never lived it. "When a cadet enters the Warbeast program, we are not simply assigned an animal. I said we are matched through a neural compatibility process. And once a match is confirmed, the beast is grown and trained specifically around that bond. It is not obedience the way a machine obeys a command. It is closer to instinct shared between two nervous systems. My fear becomes something he can sense. His alertness becomes something I can sense. Over years, that sharing deepens into something the program calls a bond flare. Though most handlers go their entire careers without ever triggering one because it only activates under a very specific condition, which is Fitch prompted, non-consensual. Hostile contact. I said the beast has to perceive that his handler is being harmed or threatened combined with unauthorized physical contact against himself. It is a fail-safe built into the biology on purpose because human handlers do not have claws or armor or venom. We built the fail-safe into the bond instead. Nobody expected an admiral of a foreign fleet to grab him by the jaw during an inspection line. Fitch studied me for a long moment, then glanced down at her data slate. The program documentation classifies this reaction as low probability. Correct. Rare enough that most instructors never witness it during an entire career. That's correct. Then why? She said slowly. Does Alliance High Command have 17 recorded incidents of exactly this reaction occurring specifically in the presence of Corv personnel spread across 9 different deployments over the last 4 years? The room went very quiet. I don't understand, I said, and I meant it. Blake pushed off from the wall, frowning. Neither did I until Fitch pulled those records an hour ago. Every incident, minor injuries, no fatalities, always triggered by physical contact from Corvith officers or Corvith-affiliated personnel, and always covered up quietly through diplomatic channels before it ever reached public record. Covered up by who? I asked. That, Fitch said, is the question I intend to answer before this tribunal convenes tomorrow. Because if this pattern is real, Cadet, then what happened on that deck today was not an accident, and it was not the first time. I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over, trying to make sense of a truth that suddenly felt much larger than one admiral and one moment of arrogance. You think the Dominion has been testing us? I said finally, testing the beasts. I think, Fitch said carefully, that an inspection tour is an excellent excuse to walk through every human ship in this fleet and provoke exactly this kind of reaction under controlled conditions. And I think somebody in Corvith Command has been quietly collecting data on it for years. Why would they want to provoke something dangerous on purpose? Blake asked. Because knowing exactly how a weapon works, Fitch said, is the first step toward knowing exactly how to defeat it. The words settled over the small room like a weight, and I realized my hands were shaking, not from fear this time, but from something closer to anger. Bramble was not a weapon they had stumbled onto. He was something they had been circling for years, waiting for an opportunity to study up close. And today, Admiral Kvan had finally taken that opportunity himself in front of every camera on the observation deck. There's something else, Fitch said, sliding the data slate across the table so I could see it. Border renegotiation talks between the Alliance and the Dominion begin in 11 days. Territory disputes along 3 contested systems. If the Dominion walks into those talks believing they understand exactly how to neutralize human war beasts, Cadet, they walk in holding significant leverage. And if this incident today gets reported as a rogue human weapon attacking a diplomat, they walk in holding even more. So they need this to look like an attack, I said slowly, understanding blooming cold and unwelcome in my chest. Not an accident, not a natural defense, an attack, deliberate and unprovoked, because that gives them exactly the leverage they need going into those talks. Which is precisely why tomorrow's tribunal matters more than you currently understand, Fitch said. Because whatever conclusion that panel reaches becomes the official record, Cadet. And once it becomes the official record, it becomes very difficult to undo. Blake exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand across his jaw. Fitch, what does she need to prove? She needs to prove the mechanism, Fitch said. Not just explain it in words. Demonstrated under controlled and consented conditions so that the panel understands exactly what triggers a bond flare and exactly why it triggered today. Because right now all they have is footage of a beast reacting violently to an admiral without any context showing what provoked it. You want me to recreate what happened? I said carefully with Bramble in front of the tribunal. I want you to control it, Fitch corrected. Show them the difference between a weapon that attacks on command and a failsafe that only activates under very specific, very provable conditions. Show them the boundary. Because if you can show that boundary clearly enough, Cadet, you don't just clear your own name. You take away the leverage the Dominion is hoping to walk into those talks with. I thought about Bramble locked somewhere in a containment bay built for hostile specimens. Probably pacing, probably listening for my voice through walls that wouldn't let it through. And I thought about Admiral Calvin lying in a medical bay somewhere on this same ship, already composing the story he intended to tell his own command about what a dangerous, uncontrolled human weapon had done to him. I'll do it, I said, but I need to see him first tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Fitch and Blake exchanged a look I couldn't fully read. Something caught between calculation and reluctant sympathy. I can authorize a supervised visit, Blake said finally. 10 minutes security present. That's the best I can offer tonight, Cadet. It's enough, I said, though it wasn't. Not really, but it was more than I expected to get. They walked me down through corridors that felt colder with every level we descended, past crew quarters and cargo bays, until we reached a section of the ship I had never needed to visit before. Reinforced doors with warning placards in 3 languages. Containment fields humming faintly behind reinforced viewports. Through one of those viewports, I saw him. Bramble was pressed against the far wall of the containment cell, head low, ears flat, every line of his body coiled with a tension that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with fear. The specific fear of being separated from the one person he had spent his entire life protecting. The moment the door slid open and he caught my scent, he was across that cell before the guards could react. And I dropped to my knees and let him press his full weight against me. Trembling, silent, the containment collar around his neck blinking a soft warning light that neither of us cared about. "I'm here," I whispered into his fur. "I'm here, and tomorrow we're going to show them exactly what you are and exactly what you're not." He exhaled against my shoulder, long and slow. And for the first time since the observation deck, I let myself believe that whatever came next, we would face it together, the way we always had. But somewhere above us, in a medical bay filled with quiet Corvith attendants, Admiral Kvan was waking up fully now, and I already knew the story he was going to tell would not match the truth even slightly. The tribunal chamber was colder than I expected, all polished metal and hard light, built for judgment rather than comfort. I stood at a small podium facing a raised panel of 7 officers, 4 human, 3 Corvith, with Commander Fitch seated to my left and Captain Blake standing near the back wall with his arms folded like a man bracing for impact. Admiral Calvan sat near the front of the chamber, upright now, his stone-colored eyes fixed on me with an expression that had cooled from rage into something far more dangerous. Patience. The lead panel officer, a stern-faced human named Colonel Priya Anand, opened the proceedings without ceremony. "This tribunal convenes to determine the classification of the incident occurring yesterday on the observation deck of the Trinity Vow. Cadet Voss, you are not currently charged with any offense, but you are required to provide full testimony regarding the nature and behavior of your bonded asset. Do you understand?" "I understand, Colonel." "Then begin," Anand said. "Explain from the beginning what happened." I told them everything. The inspection line, Calvin's comments, the moment his hand closed around Bramble's jaw, the current that passed between us that. I still did not fully understand myself. I kept my voice level, my hands still, and I did not look away from the panel even when Calvin shifted in his seat, clearly impatient to speak. When I finished, Anand nodded once and turned toward the Admiral. "Admiral Calvan, you are permitted to respond." Calvin rose slowly, straightening the front of his uniform with deliberate care, playing to the room the way he had played to the cameras on the observation deck. "What this cadet describes as an accident," he said, "was an unprovoked assault by an uncontrolled biological weapon deployed against a ranking officer during a sanctioned diplomatic inspection. I touched the creature exactly as I have touched 100 specimens during 100 inspections across a dozen species. Only this specimen chose to attack me. You gripped his jaw and forced it open without consent," I said before I could stop myself. "Cadet Voss," Anand warned. "I apologize, Colonel," I said, though I did not feel apologetic at all. Calvin smiled thinly. "The cadet is emotional. Understandably so, given what her creature has done. But emotion does not change the fact that a human weapon disabled a Dominion officer, and that this is not, according to my own command's records, the first time something similar has occurred aboard an Alliance vessel." That last sentence landed heavier than he probably intended, because it confirmed exactly what Fitch had suspected the night before, that the Dominion already knew about the pattern, had perhaps always known about it, long before anyone on the human side started connecting the same dots. Fitch rose smoothly from her seat. "Colonel, if the tribunal will permit, I would like to submit evidence directly relevant to the Admiral's claim of a pattern." Anand nodded and the chamber lights dimmed as a display activated above the panel, showing a timeline stretching back for years marked with small red points scattered across different star systems, different Alliance vessels. "These," Fitch said, "are 17 previously undocumented incidents involving human-bonded war beasts and Corvith personnel quietly resolved through diplomatic channels rather than official record. In every single case, the trigger was identical. Unauthorized physical contact initiated by a Corvith officer against a bonded beast resulting in a neurological feedback response. Not a single incident involved the beast initiating contact. Not a single incident resulted in fatality. And in every single case, records show that Corvith medical personnel requested access to biometric data from the affected beast within hours of the event. A murmur passed through the Corvith section of the panel, quick and low, and I watched two of the three alien officers exchange a look that told me this was not news to them either. "What are you suggesting, Commander?" Anand asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "I am suggesting," Fitch said, "that these incidents were not random accidents, but rather the predictable result of a pattern of deliberate, repeated, non-consensual contact initiated specifically to study a biological reaction the Dominion has known about for years. I am suggesting that Admiral Calvin's inspection yesterday was not an innocent gesture, but the continuation of a program of provocation that has been ongoing across this fleet since long before Cadet Voss was ever assigned her current post." Calvin's composure cracked for the first time, just slightly, a tightening around his stone eyes. "These are unfounded accusations," he said. "Coincidence is not conspiracy, Commander." 17 coincidences, Fitch replied evenly, occurring only around Corvith contact, only ever quietly resolved rather than officially reported, is not a pattern I am comfortable calling coincidence, Admiral. Anand held up a hand before the exchange could escalate further. "The tribunal will require direct demonstration before drawing conclusions from historical pattern alone. Cadet Voss, are you prepared to demonstrate the mechanism described in your testimony under controlled and fully consented conditions so that this panel can observe the boundary between provoked response and unprovoked aggression?" "I am, Colonel." They brought Bramble into the chamber 20 minutes later, led on a soft restraint rather than a containment pole, his ears still low from a night spent apart from me. But his eyes found mine the instant the doors opened, and something in his posture eased immediately. I knelt and let him press against my side, and I felt the tension bleeding out of both of us in equal measure. "The demonstration will proceed as follows," Fitch explained to the panel. "Two separate contact scenarios will be presented. In the first, a volunteer will approach and touch the beast with full consent, communicated clearly beforehand, both to the beast and to Cadet Voss. In the second, contact will be initiated without prior consent, replicating the conditions of yesterday's incident, but under controlled medical supervision and with immediate intervention available." Captain Blake stepped forward for the first scenario, having volunteered the night before, and approached slowly with his palm open, speaking softly, giving Bramble time to see him coming. Time to understand there was no threat in the gesture. He rested his hand briefly against Bramble's shoulder, and nothing happened at all. No current, no reaction beyond a slight curious tilt of the head, because that was exactly the point. Consent changed everything. Then came the second scenario, and this was where my chest tightened despite every rehearsal Fitch had walked me through the night before. A Corvith volunteer, one of the panel's own research attendants, approached without announcing himself, without pausing, and gripped Bramble's jaw with the exact same motion Calvin had used the day before, sudden, forceful, uninvited. The reaction was immediate, but this time medical monitors were already attached, recording every microsecond of the response. And this time, a containment team stood ready with a neural dampening field, prepared to interrupt the feedback the instant the data was captured. The Corvith volunteer staggered, gasped, dropped to one knee, and the dampening field activated within 2 seconds, cutting the current before it could do more than momentarily overwhelm his nervous system. The chamber fell utterly silent as the volunteer was helped upright, shaken but conscious, already nodding to confirm he was unharmed. "There," Fitch said quietly, turning toward the panel. "Consent changes the outcome entirely. This is not a weapon that attacks on command or attacks without cause. This is a biological failsafe activating only under one very specific condition: non-consensual hostile physical contact against a bonded beast. Admiral Kvan created that condition himself yesterday on the observation deck in full view of recorded footage." Anan studied the monitor data in silence for a long moment before turning her attention fully toward Kvan. "Admiral, you have testified that your contact with the beast was standard inspection procedure. Yet, this demonstration confirms that the exact same contact performed without consent produces the exact same reaction you experienced yesterday. Do you maintain that Cadet Voss deployed her beast as a weapon against you? Calvin's jaw tightened, and for the first time since I had met him, I watched him search for words and come up short. I maintain, he said finally, that this creature poses an unacceptable risk to Alliance personnel regardless of the mechanism behind it. That is a separate question from the one currently before this tribunal. Anan said the question before us is whether Cadet Voss committed assault against a ranking officer. Based on the evidence and demonstration presented, this tribunal finds no basis for that charge. A ripple went through the chamber, and I felt my knees nearly give out with relief. One hand pressed flat against Bramble's back to steady myself as much as him. But Anand was not finished. However, she continued, this tribunal has also observed a documented pattern of deliberate, repeated, non-consensual contact initiated by Dominion personnel against Alliance-bonded assets spanning 4 years and 17 prior incidents, none of which were properly reported through official channels. This tribunal will be referring that pattern for a separate formal investigation and recommends that Admiral Calvin's conduct during yesterday's inspection be reviewed under Alliance diplomatic protocol violations. Calvin's face went rigid, a stillness far more telling than any outburst could have been, because I understood in that moment that he had walked into this tribunal expecting to leave with my career and Bramble's life in his hands, and instead he was walking out with his own conduct under formal review. As the chamber began to empty, one of the Corps research attendants, an older officer who had said nothing throughout the entire proceeding, approached Fitch and me near the podium. He introduced himself quietly as Researcher Vale Orinth, part of the Dominion's Biological Sciences Division, and his tone carried none of Calvin's contempt. I would like to submit a formal request, he said, choosing his words with visible care for cooperative study, not provocation, into the bonding mechanism your species has developed. What we witnessed today was not a weakness to be exploited, Cadet Voss. It was something my own species abandoned pursuing centuries ago, because we decided trust between handler and construct was inefficient, easily manipulated. Perhaps we were wrong. I looked down at Bramble, who was watching Orinth with cautious, measured attention rather than the tension he had shown around every other Corvus officer in that room. And something in that small detail told me more than any tribunal ruling could have. I'll consider it, I said honestly. But it will be on my terms, researcher. Consent always. No exceptions. Understood. Orinth said with something that might have been the beginning of respect. I suspect, Cadet, that consent is precisely the lesson my own people most urgently need to learn. I did not know yet, standing there with my hand resting on Bramble's back, that Orinth's quiet request would become the first thread in unraveling something far larger than one admiral's arrogance, a program the Dominion had been running in the shadows for years, and that the true scale of it was only beginning to surface. 3 days after the tribunal, Commander Fitch called me into a briefing room on the lower deck, and the look on her face told me the investigation had grown into something much bigger than a single inspection gone wrong. We pulled the full communication logs from Admiral Calvin's flagship, she said, sliding a data slate across the table toward me. And Cadet, this is no longer just about you and Bramble. The slate showed a web of encrypted transmissions, dozens of them stretching back nearly 5 years, all routed through diplomatic channels that were supposed to be reserved for trade negotiations and border logistics. Buried inside that traffic disguised as routine inspection reports were detailed biometric files, the same kind of neural feedback data collected from every one of the 17 prior incidents. They weren't just documenting accidents, Fitch said. They were building a complete profile. Response thresholds, recovery times, which contact points triggered the strongest reaction. This wasn't curiosity, Cadet. This was reconnaissance. For the border talks, I said quietly, remembering what she had told me the night of my arrest. For the border talks, Fitch confirmed. The Dominion delegation intends to argue for expanded territory across 3 contested systems in 8 days. Walking into that negotiation with detailed knowledge of exactly how to disable a human-bonded asset gives them enormous leverage because right now war beasts are deployed alongside nearly a third of Alliance frontier patrols. If the Dominion can demonstrate they know how to neutralize that defense reliably, our negotiating position collapses. Kvan. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something cold settle low in my stomach. Calvin wasn't testing Bramble out of arrogance, I said slowly. He already knew what would happen. He wanted it on record, on camera, in front of witnesses, so his own command would have proof exactly when they needed it. That is precisely what I believe, Fitch said. And it very nearly worked, Cadet. If this tribunal had ruled differently, if we hadn't demonstrated the consent boundary so clearly, the official alliance record would show a rogue human weapon assaulting a diplomat. The Dominion could have used that record as justification for restricting bonded beast deployment across the entire frontier, right before territorial negotiations began. Captain Blake entered partway through the briefing, looking like he hadn't slept properly in days. "There's more," he said, taking a seat heavily. Command reached out to every unit currently operating bonded war beasts across the fleet. Following the tribunal's findings, we asked a simple question. Has your beast ever reacted unexpectedly to unauthorized contact from Dominion personnel? And I asked, though I suspected I already knew. 31 additional incidents, Blake said, 31 cadet that were never reported at all, quietly absorbed by handlers who assumed it was simply an isolated malfunction or who were pressured by their own chain of command to avoid diplomatic friction. Every single incident matches the same pattern. Every single one involves Corvith contact. The scale of it settled over me slowly. The realization that this had never been about one arrogant admiral testing one cadet's beast. It had been systematic, patient, spread across years and dozens of ships. And it had almost worked perfectly because nobody had ever connected the pattern until Bramble's reaction happened in front of enough cameras that it could not be quietly buried. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Fitch said, "Alliance Command takes this evidence directly into the border negotiations, not as a liability, Cadet, but as leverage of our own. The Dominion spent years secretly gathering data on a defense mechanism in violation of at least 4 separate diplomatic protocols. That is not a small thing to bring into a negotiation table." Blake leaned forward. "But there's a complication. Calvin hasn't backed down. He's filed a formal request through Dominion Command demanding Bramble be classified as a hazardous bowpawn and surrendered for what he's calling containment analysis before the talks begin. He's framing it as a good faith gesture, proof that humanity isn't hiding dangerous secrets going into negotiations." My hands curled into fists before I could stop them. He wants to take Bramble apart to study exactly what he already knows. "That's my read as well," Fitch said, "which is why we need to move quickly. I've requested an emergency review before the full Alliance Council using everything we've gathered, the tribunal footage, the communication logs, the 31 additional incidents. If we can get ahead of Calvin's request before it reaches formal review, we can frame this correctly as evidence of Dominion misconduct rather than justification for surrendering your beast." The council convened 2 days later in a chamber far larger than the tribunal room, filled with representatives from a dozen member species across the alliance. Human delegates seated alongside Retheri diplomats with their soft, luminous markings. Cadet representatives whose translated voices always carried a faint musical undertone. And near the back, watching silently, researcher Vale Orenth present as an independent Corvith observer rather than part of Calvin's official delegation. I was not required to speak, but Fitch had asked me to be present, standing quietly near the evidence display as she walked the full council through everything that had been uncovered. I watched the reactions ripple across unfamiliar alien faces as the scale of the pattern became clear, watched expressions shift from polite diplomatic patience into something closer to genuine concern. When Fitch finished, the presiding alliance delegate, an older human woman named Counselor Grace Whitfield, turned her attention toward the small Corvith delegation seated across the chamber. "Admiral Calvin," she said, "you have requested surrender of the bonded asset in question for containment analysis. Given the evidence presented today, do you maintain that request?" Calvin rose slowly, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something in his posture that looked almost like retreat. "The evidence presented," he said carefully, "appears to suggest irregularities in how certain data was gathered. I would need time to review these claims before commenting further." "Take the time," Whitfield said, not unkindly, "but understand, Admiral, that this council does not intend to authorize surrender of any bonded alliance asset, while a formal investigation into unauthorized data collection remains open. Your request is denied, pending that investigation's conclusion." A quiet murmur moved through the chamber, and I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in days. a tightness I hadn't fully realized I was carrying until it began to ease. Orinth rose from his seat near the back, requesting permission to address the council, and Whitfield granted it with a small nod. "I wish to state for the record," Orinth said, his voice steady, "that not all within the Dominion condone the methods described here today. There are those among my people who believe understanding should come through cooperation, not covert provocation. I formally request on behalf of the Dominion Biological Sciences Division, independent of Admiral Calvin's delegation, that any future study of bonded asset behavior proceed only through consented, transparent partnership with Alliance handlers." I watched Calvin's jaw tighten as Orinth spoke, watched the quiet fracture opening between two factions within his own delegation, one still clinging to leverage gained through deception, the other beginning to recognize that the ground beneath that strategy had just crumbled in front of the entire council. Request noted. Whitfield said this council will take it under formal consideration alongside the ongoing investigation. As the session adjourned and delegates began filing out, Fitch found me near the evidence display, allowing herself a small, tired smile for the first time since I had met her. "You did well, Cadet," she said. "Better than well. You gave this council something they could actually use." "It wasn't me," I said honestly. "It was Bramble. He's the one who reacted. I just refused to let them turn that reaction into something it wasn't. That," Fitch said, "is exactly why it worked." Outside the council chamber, walking back toward the containment level, where Bramble was finally being released from observation status, I passed Calvin in the corridor, flanked by two of his own officers, his expression unreadable in the dim overhead light. He stopped when he saw me, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. "You should have simply apologized," he said finally, quiet enough that only I could hear it. "This would have ended quickly, quietly, the way these things are meant to end. You touched something that wasn't yours to touch, Admiral," I said, meeting his stone-colored eyes without flinching. "And now the whole Alliance knows exactly why that was a mistake." He held my gaze a moment longer, then turned and walked away without another word. And I understood, watching him go, that whatever came next in the border talks, in the ongoing investigation, in whatever quiet retaliation his faction might still attempt, the balance between our two peoples had shifted permanently the moment his hand closed around Bramble's jaw on that observation deck. I just did not yet know how far that shift would carry us. The border talks began 5 days later aboard a neutral station orbiting the edge of the contested systems. And Alliance Command asked me to be present, not to speak, but simply to stand as a visible reminder of exactly what had almost been buried and exactly what had come to light instead. Bramble walked beside me through the station's long observation corridor, his containment collar gone now, replaced by nothing more than the simple bonded tether every certified handler wore, and I felt the weight of every eye that turned to watch us pass. The negotiation chamber itself was smaller than I expected, a round room ringed with viewports looking out over the slow-turning stars. Delegates from both the Alliance and the Dominion seated across from one another at a long curved table. Councillor Whitfield led the human delegation, calm and unhurried, while the Dominion side was led not by Admiral Calvin, as everyone had expected, but by a senior Dominion diplomat named Chancellor Ireel's son, an older figure with quieter, more measured eyes than Calvin had ever shown. Admiral Calvin has been reassigned pending the conclusion of the investigation into unauthorized data collection, Whitfield informed the room early in the session, and I watched the reaction ripple through both delegations. Quiet satisfaction on the human side, careful, controlled acceptance on the Dominion side. This council trusts that today's discussion can proceed on terms of genuine transparency rather than leverage gathered through covert means. Chancellor Sun inclined his head slowly. "The Dominion acknowledges the findings of your investigation," he said, his voice carrying none of Calvin's contempt, and offers formal acknowledgement that certain methods employed were inconsistent with the spirit of cooperative relations between our peoples. "We come to this table today seeking agreement, not advantage." I stood near the back of the chamber with Bramble pressed lightly against my leg, listening as the talks unfolded over the following hours. Territorial boundaries redrawn with careful precision. Resource sharing agreements negotiated line by line. And underneath all of it, an unspoken current that had not existed in any previous Alliance-Dominion negotiation. A recognition that humanity's bonded war beasts were not a curiosity to be studied and defeated, but a defense mechanism earned through a completely different philosophy of war, one built on trust rather than obedience. It was near the end of the session during a short recess that the tension I had been half expecting finally surfaced. I had stepped into a side corridor to let Bramble stretch his legs after hours of stillness when one of Calvin's former officers, a younger Corps lieutenant named Drask, approached from a side passage with two others flanking him. His posture was tight, controlled, but his eyes carried the same simmering resentment I had seen in Calvin's before everything unraveled. "You embarrassed the Admiral," Drask said quietly, stopping a few paces away. "You embarrassed my people in front of the entire Alliance Council." "Your Admiral embarrassed himself," I said evenly, keeping my hand resting lightly on Bramble's neck, feeling the low hum of alertness building beneath his fur without a single command needed to explain why. I only made sure the truth was the thing that got recorded. "The talks conclude in less than an hour," Drask said, taking a slow step closer. Close enough that Bramble's ears flattened and a low sound began building in his chest. Not aggression, simply readiness. Perhaps it would serve everyone if this creature demonstrated one final time exactly how unstable it truly is before the final signatures are exchanged. I understood exactly what he was suggesting. A last desperate attempt to manufacture one more incident, one more piece of manufactured chaos to throw doubt over the talks before they could be finalized. And I felt something cold and steady settle over me instead of fear. "Take one more step toward him without consent," I said quietly, "and you will learn exactly what Admiral Calvin learned. Except this time, there will be no confusion about what provoked it. Because I am telling you clearly right now in front of witnesses that this is not consented contact." Drask hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the two officers flanking him, clearly searching for support that did not come, because even they seemed to understand how badly this could end for all three of them, given everything the Council had already uncovered. It was researcher Orntha's voice that broke the standoff, calm and firm, arriving from the corridor behind them. "Lieutenant Drask," he said, "I would strongly advise you reconsider whatever you intend here. The Council is one signature away from concluding these talks successfully. Whatever remains of Admiral Calvin's reputation will not survive an incident deliberately provoked by his former officers during the final hour of negotiation." Drask's jaw tightened, but he stepped back, the tension bleeding slowly out of his shoulders as he recognized the position he had nearly put himself in. "This is not finished," he muttered, though the words carried far less weight than he clearly intended. "It is finished," Ornth said simply. "Your Admiral tried to gain leverage through provocation, and it cost him everything he was trying to protect. I would not recommend repeating his mistake." Drask turned and walked away without another word, his officers following close behind. And I let out a slow breath, feeling Bramble's tension finally ease beneath my hand. "Thank you," I said to Ornth, who studied Bramble with the same careful curiosity he had shown since the tribunal. "I did not do it for you, Cadet," he said, though his tone carried no unkindness. "I did it because my people have spent years pursuing an advantage built on deception, and I am tired of watching it cost us more than it ever gained. Perhaps it is time we tried understanding instead." The talks concluded less than an hour later, both delegations signing the finalized border agreement under the quiet observation of the full council. And as the chamber began to empty, Chancellor Sun approached Whitfield with a request that would have seemed unthinkable only 2 weeks earlier. "The Dominion would like to formally request," Sun said, "a cooperative program between our fleets, beginning with volunteer placement of Alliance-bonded handler units alongside Dominion frontier patrols for mutual protection along the newly established border." Whitfield glanced toward me for a brief moment before answering. "That request will need to go through proper channels," she said, "but I do not believe it will be dismissed easily, Chancellor. I suspect several member species will be submitting similar requests before the week is finished." She was right. Within 3 days, formal requests arrived from 2 additional Alliance member species, both previously dismissive of human military contributions, both suddenly eager to place bonded handler units within their own fleet formations. And I understood, reading through the reports Fitz shared with me, that something fundamental had shifted across the entire Alliance. Not because of one dramatic incident, but because that incident had finally forced everyone to look closely at something humanity had quietly built over generations and to recognize it for what it actually was. I found myself back aboard the Thinity's Vow a week later, standing on the same observation deck where everything had begun, watching through the wide viewport as the fleet reorganized into new patrol formations along the freshly signed border. For the first time in the history of the Joint Alliance fleet, human vessels were being positioned at the leading edge of the formation rather than tucked safely toward the rear. A small adjustment on paper, but one that carried enormous weight to anyone who understood what it represented. Bramble sat beside me, calm now, his earlier tension long since faded, watching the same shifting formation of ships through the viewport with the quiet patience of a creature who had simply been doing exactly what he was built to do, protecting the person beside him. Nothing more complicated than that. Captain Blake found me there, studying the same view, and stood quietly beside me for a long moment before speaking. "Command wants to formally commend you, Cadet," he said. "Officer recommendation, fast-tracked. Promotion, review, the works. Seems your name is being mentioned rather favorably across several fleet briefings this week." "I didn't do anything special," I said honestly. "I just refused to let them turn the truth into something convenient." "That," Blake said, "is precisely what made the difference. I thought about Admiral Calvin. Somewhere far from this fleet now, reassigned to a quiet post far from any position of influence. His reputation permanently marked by an investigation that would follow him for the rest of his career. I thought about researcher Orinth quietly beginning the first cooperative study program between our two peoples, built entirely on consent rather than provocation. I thought about the 31 handlers across the fleet who had finally come forward, no longer afraid to admit what their own bonded beasts had done because the truth had finally become something worth protecting rather than hiding. And I thought about the exact moment standing on this same deck when a Corvette admiral had reached out and gripped Bramble's jaw like he was inspecting livestock, certain that humanity's greatest defense was nothing more than an oversized pet playing soldier. He had been wrong in a way that would echo through Alliance command for years to come. Because what he touched that day was not a weapon built for obedience and not a construct built for efficiency. It was something far older, something grown from trust between two living creatures who had chosen each other long before either of them understood exactly what that choice would cost or exactly what it would come to mean. I rested my hand against Bramble's neck, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing beneath my palm, and watched the fleet settle into its new formation against the endless dark beyond the viewport. He had touched Bramble like he was nothing more than livestock waiting to be inspected. It only took that one touch for an entire alien fleet to finally understand exactly what humanity had been quietly breeding for war all along.